So today we are going to be doing the Bustle era. And again, as I always say, with these individual sort of smaller eras we're talking about in the Victorian times, they don't reference anything but the costume or the clothing of the time, right? There are no bustle books. You know, we have the romantic authors, we have romantic architecture, we have those things. There are no crinoline books. There's no crinoline art. We tend to now take these big movements and, because fashion is moving so quickly, start to reevaluate how we look at these things. So as we're going forward today, one of the things I want you to remember is we're really dealing with clothes as clothes and understanding the process of how these silhouettes will change, much like the crinoline period. We're really focusing on very specific silhouettes. And so if you're doing your notebook, if you're doing some of those elements, what you'll ultimately really be focusing on is not so much the terms, because the terms are in a lot of ways the same, but dealing with and understanding the sort of situational silhouette ideas that are happening. Does that make sense? Awesome. Now, the 1870s, 1880s are a very crazy time because, again, we're dealing with a lot of technology, a lot of what I call modernism, where people are trying to think, you know, in the sense of modernity. And because the 20th century is just a breath away from us, there's a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm for what is going to be happening. So as we're sort of going through this, what we're ultimately kind of keynoting, I guess, for every point is that people are trying to stay ahead of the trend. And as we had talked about last time with Mr. Charles Worth, he is certainly very happy to jump into that. And a lot of what we're going to be seeing today was brought about by him. Now, because up till this point, up until kind of Charles Worth, people were sort of gravitating towards styles, silhouettes, and ideas that were based on an individual, right? Marie Antoinette is in power. What does Marie Antoinette like? That sort of references down, and it can change very quickly. But because he is kind of the arbiter of what style is, he will not only anticipate what is going to be happening, but we see a much smoother transition through the rest of the 19th century, because it's, even though it's, oh, this has to look new, so it needs a new silhouette, it still has a reference to kind of what came before it. Does that make sense? So we're not seeing as much of a like overnight switch and then overnight switch and overnight switch. What we're starting to see is a gradual movement, even more so than we've seen before, of big ideas. Now, during this period also, things like sewing machines start to, especially in the United States, become incredibly popular and are actually affordable to some degree by the individual person. And so that means that now their wardrobe can be opened up in a great deal to be able to manifest these things they put on their bodies. And we start to see a great deal of these clothes becoming visually complicated, but with more taste kind of attached to them. When we think about some of these dynamic movements from the past, we tend to see what I call that hot glue decoration on them, right? Trying to get as much decoration as possible and noticeable. In this period, they're using mechanization in a lot of ways to reevaluate how we do things. So we'll see a lot of machine-made lace. We'll see a lot of machine-made pleating. We'll see a lot of machine-made things that can then be applied to these garments in a very thoughtful way. The overall appearance of this period, though, is what we tend to think of when we talk about Victoria. And if you think about it, we're really towards the end of it, right? We're almost at the end of the century. And yet this is where we start to develop those ideas that we tend to, if you do a Google search on Wish or something like that, when it shows Victorian, it's basically anything. But we tend to think of those high necks. We tend to think of those tiny waists. We tend to think of, you know, volume and texture and usage of fabric in many ways. And so we have to always be super, super careful when we're thinking of Victorian, because it's really now those things that are starting to find their way into our vernacular of styles. Okay? So the first thing that I like to do today is I really want to talk about silhouette. So the reason silhouette is so important is that in this bustle period, and if you read the lecture, you saw that I kind of prepped you for this, but we have three very dominant themes that happen throughout the course of it. So phase one is a very easy transition from where we came from that 1860s crinoline style, where our bustle is still in a lot of ways a verb. Okay, so when I'm using it as a verb, what does bustle mean? To bring the fabric from the skirt towards the back. And so a lot of the silhouette is navigated in a lot of ways by the fabric moving. Now, one of the things, this is one of those David things. It's not like nobody has written a research paper about it, I'm sure. But in my mind, if we think about the crinoline, think of how expensive, Gesundheit, those textiles were. Think of how much fabric we packed into those. The last thing we probably want to do is just throw them away, right? We've spent all this time getting to this point, and then we're like, oh, crud, what are we going to do? So I leave our crinoline lady here to sort of see how we can do this in some ways. Now, the underskirt here, the crinoline, is very large, so we don't tend to see that. But imagine, really, all you would have to do to start to feel like you're in style is by taking your overskirt and pulling it back. See? Boom. Our 1860 style, as you remember, was very much towards the back of the dress. Well, now we can use the fabric in our overskirts and manipulate that to give us a sense of volume toward the back. And you can see that it feels a lot like drapery. And so when we look at it from the side, we tend to see it feel a bit more bubbly. And when we look at it from the front, we still kind of see some conical kind of roundness to it, because they're still trying to figure it out. In a sense, there's a lot of pull from the mantua idea that we've seen before, but it's all sort of drawn back. The problem, though, is it's awkward. The proportions kind of get thrown off in this really weird way, and it takes people a while to sort of navigate through that. We're going to look at a slide coming up later where we see that they would even play with some of those weird proportions and pad themselves out to help manifest the silhouette of the time. And one of the most intriguing and weird things is that often they would put a pad right here in the front to round out kind of over your body here. That muffin top, they're sort of, you know, if we remember that term from, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, they're sort of emphasizing that. What that does is that minimizes the waist, but it really does give an odd sense to the front. But slowly as it moves along through phase one, they're going to elongate the bodice a little bit and a little bit and a little bit until it starts to really mold over the body. And then once they start that, they're like, let's do something cool. And we move on to phase two. In phase two, we also call the natural form. Why do you think we call this the natural form? Okay, it's molded to the almost classic silhouette of the body. Now, is there padding in there? Yes. Is it exaggerated to some degree? Yes. However, probably for the first time in history, in a lot of ways, we see the natural undulations of the female body as it kind of is, with breasts, with a roundness to the waist, with a roundness to the hip. Part of this also manifests because of a sewing technique. Now, everything that we've been doing up until this point, we've really been dealing with like shaped pieces, but still big shaped pieces. And through this period, we tend to want, in cutting our textiles, to have seams that run from the shoulder over the bust, through the waist, and then through the hip. So remember me talking about gores and godets, right? Godets are little inserts, gores are shapes that move all the way down, and their shapes, when they're sewn together, mold the body. Well, you can see how this sort of seaming would help create a very definitive shape on the body without a lot of extra textile. What do we call those seams when they run from the shoulder over the bust down the body? Princess seams, correct. And those become incredibly important. We still see these today, especially for sheath dresses and things, where we want a great deal of fit all the way down. Now, it seems like a super small thing, but it changes how clothes can fit on the body. Because up until this time, we're sort of wrapping and pinning and clutching and sewing. And now we're using a very concerted idea of kind of goring the entire body to create a shape. And if we look at it from the front, can you see how it's incredibly different from phase one? It's releasing and removing almost all of the front volume when you're looking at it front on, as close as possible. But why we still consider it part of the bustle is look at the side. Because if you notice, we see roundness through the back into the waist. We see padding and a little bit of roundness at the bum. But then we tend to see volume happen right at the bottom of the bum. And when that happens, it's everything. Like, what can we put there to sort of even emphasize it more? We see bows, we see flowers, and then we see volume extending out into like trains and such. What are some great things about this?
Less fabric.
Okay, certainly less fabric use.
Oh, easier to like move around into.
Maybe perhaps a little bit more ease of movement. We're going to talk about why that is like, it feels that way, but it's actually right.
Yeah.
Because you are continuing this line all the way through the hips. A lot of times the corsets would need to continue well down into the hip to keep that nice and smooth. And you can imagine that that would be a little challenging. However, because of things like elastics, they can maybe, sort of add little panels and such so you have still some movement. Notice that it's not tight all the way down, so they do have still movement. What would be some other good things, some bad things perhaps, or challenges that we might see?
Whatever's causing the structure down here, you have to be like lower on the leg.
Right. And so things like sitting, things like anything that folds at this point, bending, moving, flexing can sometimes be a little difficult. And even when we look at the portraits, we tend to see people leaning. One of my favorite photographs from this period is incorporating what's called a recamier. Today we call them chaise longue, but there was this woman, Madame Recamier, who they named it after, which is, a long sort of sofa but you see her leaning on it, and literally she's like this, right? We tend to think of those fainting couches or such where you sort of move into them. No, not at all. She's like, The other thing that becomes popular too for some of these styles is jersey. So what do we think of it when we say jersey? What do we think of? A knit fabric, exactly. And so knits can become very popular in this time because you can mold over the body. They're still figuring out how to use them on the daily. And a lot of the things that we'll look at in slides still are woven fabrics. But where they come very useful are combinations. So before we had talked about this idea of shifts, and we talked about the idea of pantalettes. Well, now they start knitting underwear that can then mold over the body. It doesn't add a lot of bulk, right? If you think about this little shift that we see here, you have to imagine all that bulk is underneath. And if you think about things like union suits, you may see union suits today. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say union suits? They're the red, full-length knit things with the little back flap, with the buttons all the way down the front, right? Those sort of come out of this period because they fit to the body. It doesn't add a great deal of bulk. You put your stay over it, and it conforms to your body. So that knit is incredibly important. Now, one of the purveyors of that was a guy named Jaeger. And Jaeger made this type. It was considered to be more hygienic because it was made out of wool as well. And so wool is considered to be easier to maintain. It's supposed to draw from the body and, as they say, more hygienic. But you can imagine that probably would be a little uncomfortable in some cases. But we understand why knitwear underneath our clothes is often very useful as opposed to a rigid cloth. This phase, usually phase 2 of the bustle, hits about, the late 1870s into the beginning of the 1880s. And it does influence what happens next, but it's not quite as popular as we would like for it to be, to show it in classes. Because then what happens is we sort of take everything we learned from phase 1 of the bustle and everything we learned about phase 2 of the bustle, and we kind of go, let's all put this together and come up with phase 3 of the bustle. And so what are we taking from phase 1 for phase 3? Correct, that bustling at the back, that volume at the back. And this is really where we can get into the noun from the verb of bustle, because we will actually have a physical element called a bustle that is tucked under there. Now, do we have it in the beginning? Sure. But now we're reaching the point where we're making them better and bigger and more inviting. So that is what we take from phase 1. And if you notice, the bustle is also more perpendicular, more cantilevered off the body, creating what I sometimes call a tea table silhouette, right? It looks like it's jetting straight out. In fact, there were illustrations, there were sculptures and things where they would show women with actually a second set of legs, like horse legs behind them, because that's kind of what it looks like, right? Like a centaur, right? But we see, the undulation through the body, which we can see through here as well. But what is probably even more apparent that we're taking from phase 2, from that? Yep, we see the tightness at the bust. And what about the skirt? Yeah, it's more flat and it's also more close at the hips. So coming forward, we see something without a ton of volume, but then you turn to the side and that's where you see the volume. And so phase 3, this 1882 onto 1891, tends to feel like the side volume from phase 1, the front volume from phase 2 merge together. Now, this is also where we start to see, pretty much when we hit that phase 2 into phase 3, the things we start to recognize for Victorian clothing, the things like the higher neck collars, the beginnings of the puff sleeves, because they realize that helps balance out the body, because ultimately our biggest thing that we're trying to do is mold the body to make the waist look as small as possible. Now, how do we mold the body? Not structure. How do we mold this upper part of the body? The corset, which we call not structure, but support, correct. So as we're looking at these silhouettes, and we'll use this one first to sort of give us a sense of what's going on, we can see that the bust is sort of moved up, the bottom part is pushed down, and then we focus on the waist. The waist being sort of the central point of what is happening. And this requires, again, corsetry underneath. What that does is it rounds out the bosom and it pushes everything else that it can. It sort of separates the two. And we're going to be dispelling some corset myths today. That's what we do. What type of bodice is this, do you think? What type of bodice? Not phases, but what type of day do you think we wear this? Okay. Why would we say this is probably an evening or a ball bodice? Okay, lack of sleeves, open décolletage, right? We want to think the more closed off we are in a lot of ways this day, the more open we are tends to be evening. So let's take off, and you can see here, we're seeing some softness here. We'll show that in a little bit. But underneath, we're starting to see some of the layers that make it up. So what are we seeing initially on the torso? What are we seeing here? Well, we will see the X-Bass in some ways. But what is this item right here? It actually has the name of the thing that it's doing. What is it covering? Right, it's covering the corset. So we call it a corset cover, exactly. Why do we need that corset cover? What it does is it covers up any of these details, it softens it, and it gives some movement around. So we can see how many layers are actually happening here. Now on this one, after I took off that corset cover, which I showed you because this time's over, we can see a form of bustle, which isn't very different from any other forms of sort of padding that we've seen before. Anybody could make this, right? It's a little pillow, it's some little ruffles, but you can imagine once the skirt goes over this, it's going to accentuate the back of the body. Back to here. So here we see one form of bustle. Pretty easy. So now we see that corset and how that's shaping the body. You see how it's coming down over the hips? So there's our waist. It's coming down this way. And again, it's trying to find the softest part of our body, which is that little notch right in between our hips. It's playing on that, and any extra flesh that we have there is either being pushed down or pushed up. Now, what are some of the things that we've learned about corsets? What are the mysteries and the problems with corsetry? Okay, it said that it restricts breathing. What else? It deforms the organs, okay. What else? Okay, limits mobility. Takes more than one person to get into it. And I think the thing that we sort of psychologically think is they have to be so tight that we have to basically ruin our bodies by making them as tiny as possible. All those things are sort of true, but also not true at all. Because a well-fit corset throughout the body is going to follow the lines of your body in every way that it's supposed to. If you've ever been for a bra fitting, perhaps, or some sort of fitting like so, you can feel very clearly the difference between a well-fitting bra and just a bra because of the way that it cuts into your body. Same sort of thing for this. It is a skill that one needs to sort of fill out and figure out, where does our body hit, where does our waist hit. We all know we have higher waists, lower waists, different parts of our bodies. Now, the idea of tight lacing, and I mentioned this before, but the idea of tight lacing through the body was generally reserved for only the most fanciful occasions. If we think about even ourselves, when we're going to prom, when we're getting married, when we're doing some sort of ceremonial thing, we might wear things that are completely uncomfortable, right? But hopefully it's not the first time. It's not like, oh, I'm going to wear high heels for the very first time. You probably have some relationship to those things. But imagine if you're wearing these every day of your life, that would be a small change in your body because your body is starting to get used to it. Now, one of the challenges that we have is we have abs. We work ourselves in a very different way than people throughout history have. Even if we've done a couple sit-ups, our world is different. We've created musculature to hold our body together, right? In this case, it's actually better that you don't have that. And if you grew up with it, you probably would not develop it the same way because the corset is doing the work for you. It's taking a little bit of physics here. It's taking all of that energy and it's spreading it throughout the body. Does that make sense? So often when people would take off their corsets, their bodies would be soft. They wouldn't be, Keira Knightley's fabulous body that when she takes off her stay in The Duchess, all of a sudden we see perfect bodies. They probably would be soft and flexible. So women, in some cases, would wear them upwards of 23 hours a day, even to sleep in. They might have sleeping corsets. But they would be different to wear. But still, imagine how uncomfortable it would be if you didn't have abs. Your body would just sort of move and your organs would shift. Now, when you tight lace, yes, you will move. And there are people who still tight lace. There's a guy named Mr. Pearl who has taken his waist and moved it down to about 12 inches, I think. And his body has changed because of it. But in most cases, it still does support the body. It's playing on the flexibility of the ribs, because that happens. It's playing on that soft part of the body there as well. Your organs, internal organs, generally stay where they are. There's just a little bit of no man's land in the middle that will eventually happen. But it's not changing your whole body and pushing them up. And even, in some circles, they say, oh, well, they removed ribs. No, they did not remove ribs. Surgery was not that strong that they could do that. Though there were people who would break their ribs, right, to sort of reshape themselves, but that's very few and far between. Really, we think that they're using the soft structure of their rib cage to sort of go along with that. In this case, we can see that bust down the front. Now, again, rigid busts are been around with us for a very long time, but this allows us to get in and out of it. And in fact, it's pretty simple. You just click one, you grab the bottom, click, 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 and now you can get into it yourself. Often the ties would come here from the waist and you would just pull them around and you could put yourself into it. You could set it enough that it was really about the size that you needed it to be. You pull the ties, tie them around, hook them under a hook, good to go. And then what do we see underneath this? The shift. And you can imagine how important that would be, because this would rub up against you. You don't want that. Now, the bones, as I mentioned before, are baleen, which mold to the body, that warm to the body, and help give some sense of the natural body in that place. From the corset, we do want to talk about the other structure that is needed throughout all of these, which is that bustle. We're going to see a few different things. Now, just based on what we've talked about, let's look at this figure that is here. Which phase would you say this figure was? Phase 3, because it's relatively narrow in the front, but it cantilevers off the back. And you can see that that would need something pretty heavy in there to take on the work. And that's a physical bustle. Now, we've seen these soft bustles, again, pillows. You can see how that would do some work. But imagine all this layering of textile on top of it, it's going to start collapsing. So we have to think of something architectural to hold it in place. One form can be something like this. This is a real bustle from the 1880s, where they've used technology, wire, and sort of created these crescent rolls, I guess you could say, that would attach around the body, and support some of that textile. These are pretty good, but you can imagine this would be a good sitting, walking around the world. When we talk about, again, there. Thank you. We tend to see, remember panniers, right? Those pocket panniers. We can see some structures that are much more similar to that require rows and rows of steel to cantilever it much more off the body. Because you can imagine, hard to see, there we go. You can imagine that you would need a great deal more rigidity to hold that in place. And so bustles, in their own idea, become something of an economy, become something that need to be made and developed. So I have a bustle that fits me. I don't know where it is. I grabbed the wrong one. This was made for the tiniest little wee person, and I tried to put it on Tuesday. I was like, oh no, nope, not gonna happen. Pull that under my butt. Now again, this is not made to be fashion. This was made to be, we're gonna see some fashionable ones, but this was made for theater. But you can see how it kind of is architectural, right? To keep all of the weight of the fabric from making it droop. You don't want the fabric to make it droop. Now, what is the issue? Now that I have this on.
Sit down.
How are you gonna sit down? As I run into the board. How am I gonna sit down?
Sideways?
Yes, exactly. So I call it the one cheek sneak. Because when you're in these, it is very difficult to sit this way, but you also have to remember that the corset, see, I keep saying stay, the corset still goes down quite a bit. And so you have to be very cautious of how you sit. So usually the way you sit is on one side of your butt. What's also great about this is it cascades the textile around. You're showing off what you're wearing. So you have to have pretty strong upper legs And I used to do David Don's address day, and I put on all this stuff so you can see how things, but in a lot of ways, you're actually just kind of resting into it on one side. Because if this chair went out, you'd just be ready to go in a lot of ways. But it is, you have to be used to it. It's very different. And when you have this, you have all this textile behind you that you need to manage. And so usually if you were approaching a chair, you think it's circles because you don't want it to get under you. So often what people do is they would flip, so the whole skirt would move behind them, and then they would settle. Or if they were getting up, they would move in circles because it would pull everything behind them. Make sense? Awesome. Now I gotta take this off. Okay. Finally, what I want to show you are some little accessories. So as I said, both in the lecture, I continue to say menswear just gets boring now. Boring, boring, boring. And so we're left with small details that make a big difference. So one thing I mentioned in the lecture is the idea of disposable cuffs and collars. So now I get to my men's section here. Oh, here's the other thing. I forgot to mention this. So things like fans certainly become very popular for women. You know, we tend to think of fans. We've seen them before, though. They've been, you know, throughout many, many periods. But one of the challenges, right? What happens if that goes down?
The man has to pick it up.
Somebody has to probably pick it up. So we often see, remember chatelaines that we talked about, that idea of like chains and things? Those would often be attached to things because you would be how does one approach this, right?
How does it work for like working women, like servants and stuff?
Well, they would still wear stays, they would still wear, you know, these details, but certainly not to the same degree as other people would. And certainly they don't need fans, right? But this idea of tying things to yourself can be very useful. So a lot of times you'll see fans have strings on them so you don't lose them. Because if a man touches your fan, a whole other story could start. Anyway, to men. So this is my little collar case. This is actually, I want to say it's probably from the 1920s, but this would be what you would travel with because inside would be your collars. Now, why would we have disposable collars or washable separate collars? Because they would get gross. They would get a little stained over time, and it allows you to keep a base shirt on, and then you just reattach a collar. The shirt that I'm wearing right now is a faux disposable collar shirt in a sense. This contrast collar really references what they would wear, which was you'd take a collar like this, you'd have a shirt that was just band, you would take studs, you know, if you think of like, you know, tuxedo studs that you've seen, you take those studs, you put it on, you have a stud in the front, and you do that. And now you have a perfectly stiff white collar. And you can see this one is paper. It's actually cardboard. But you can see how rigid that would be. And after it got dirty, after it got gross, you could just throw it away. And you sometimes see this with cuffs. Or, you know, these are cloth. These are probably from the 1930s, I would say. But you can see how starched those still are. And you would wash them, you get them washed, they'd starch them very stiffly, and then you'd put them on, you can even hear them crack. That's my favorite, is when they crack. And you could see all the way up into the 20s and 30s, we had regular collars too. Just traditional collars like we understand collars. So little details like this are really cool. I love this, because it has a little place to slot the studs too. Isn't it beautiful? Things like gloves become incredibly important. So these are kid leather day gloves. They're in gray. Hopefully I won't rip this one. I ripped the other one the other day. But you can see these are very different from those band gloves that you might have worn at one point in your life. Those knit sort of one size fits most sort of things. These are made for your hands, the exact shape of your hands. And you can understand how good tailoring and good construction would be incredibly important. So these are suede, these are evening gloves, and these are made out of kid leather. And so you can see that there are lots of great little details on those as well, but very different. See, that's the, it'll blow out. A little sad, but. So kid is made from goat, baby goat, which are kids, right? And so it's very supple. And that's why you have like evening gloves are often made of kid, because what you would do is you would soak them in water and then put them on your arm for women. And it would, what it would do is it would shrink down and sort of tighten up. But if you notice, on women's gloves, there's a series of 3 buttons usually, even the knit ones right here at the wrist. The idea of that is if you were eating dinner, what you do is you unbutton those 3 buttons, pull, 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 pull. You would take the glove and you would tuck it into itself because you would want your hands to eat with. You wouldn't want to get stuff on your gloves. So some people did, some people, but that's ultimately how you do it. But a lot of times this was so tight, you know, for those special occasions that you couldn't just like pull it off. So last thing I want to show you are top hats. And again, men don't have a great deal to play with. So they really focus on the things that they do have. Now, this is a top hat, probably again from the 20s or the 30s, but it's made in the manner that they would be at this time. So when we think of these top hats, what do we think they're made of? What is in our mind? We're like, oh, these are made out of. Okay, maybe wool. Does this look like wool? Now, a lot of times what we do in theaters, we create them out of satin, right? So that they have that shiny effect. However, what this actually is fur. And if you notice, can you see on the top, it looks like a record? You know, when you take a record and you flex it in the light, it spins, because these are all individual hairs. You need something like this, a brush, and you brush that into that semicircle. So all these hairs are moving around. In fact, you can see just a little bit of it is starting to rub off. The same on the sides as well. So you would imagine this would take a great deal of maintenance to keep it perfect. And so status comes through these details. Now, can it be made out of felt? Sure. But that's how you know it's a gentleman, right? And if you look at the lid or the brim, can you see how it's a little pocky down there? Because that's where, when you would wear it, you know, you would grab it to take it off. And so those are, it's sort of been. What kind of fur? Well, it used to be beaver fur, and then I forget what this one is. Well, but that's the thing. That's what makes it expensive. That's what makes it beautiful. I can't remember what this one is. And it's then eventually what they started to do was use silk velvet, like a very fine silk velvet. But when you feel it, it feels like the most beautiful animal you've ever touched in life. So anyway, so the details are what matters. Yes.
How would you store that? Because I see what you have it in right now.
So this is the part of the box that it came in. It was in this incredible leather box that started to break down. I couldn't save it, but you would store it, you know, in an enclosed thing. You would have certainly valets, servants who would take care of it for you, you know, but you would have to be really careful. And once it kind of broke, you wouldn't just fix it. You would go and have to get a new one. So you can see here that this protects it. And interestingly, I have used this in a number of productions, and it's still holding up pretty well. But I have a little system in which people have to sign it out, and they wear it, and then it goes right back in the box. But do you mind hitting the lights for me? Thank you. Okay. So, as I had mentioned in the lecture, we need to acknowledge that a screen. We need to acknowledge a screen, but we also need to acknowledge art movements of the period. And the biggest art movement certainly was the idea of the Impressionists. So what do we know about the Impressionists? Nothing? We've never learned anything about the Impressionists. Yes, you are art students. Well, we recognize the Impressionists. We recognize the style of it, of Monet, Manet, and such. But as I had mentioned, once photography starts to become popular, we don't need art to necessarily represent photorealism. And we see a string of artists who are starting to develop their style to give you an impression of the spirit of the place that you are, more so than the sort of photographic nature of the thing. Does that make sense? And so when we look at this, we can see lily pads, and I've seen plenty of lily pads in my day. But more often than not, what we're trying to get is a sense of the environment, the spirit, the world that they feel when they're looking out on this. And so here, you get the dapples of light. The images themselves aren't photorealistic, but you are there and you understand the space. You can even look at something like this, which really does set the tone for the place that you are. Here we are in London looking over Parliament. However, I don't need the photographic details to inform us. Now, this was rejected. This was a rejected art style in the beginning. And now it is truly the most popular, like financially, artist style. If a museum has a retrospective of Impressionist work, they're going to make themselves solve it in about 15 minutes because everybody wants to see this work. This sort of second most popular art exhibits, fashion exhibits. Always breaks every record. You ever heard about the Savage Beauty event for Alexander McQueen? People were queuing up for like 10 hours to see this exhibit, so much so that they would open the museums on Mondays so people could come in. All they would do is see this one exhibit, and they would sell it like it was $50 a ticket or something. Somebody was super smart and said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do an exhibit that's both Impressionist art and the clothing. And that did exceptionally well toward 3 or 4 cities. But to us, this is very peaceful. It's very normal. Maybe to some, it's even banal. But in its time, it was considered to be insane. Look at this. Here we see Renoir. We can see a beautiful painting. But if you look at it really up close, it's not much of anything. It's just dabs of paint. But we can see certainly the light, the movement. There's a sense of activity about it in its sort of rushed nature. And it's giving us, again, more of an impression of what they're seeing than a photographic representation. I mean, this woman here in her phase 1 outfit is really just a whole bunch of blots of paint. But our eye connects it, brings it together. So timetable-wise, here we are in the 1860s, and slowly we can see everything kind of moving more towards the back. So by the time we're in 69 and 70, even into 72, can you see how it's really kind of that idea, like the restoration of pulling that Modeste up? But do you notice how it's still kind of round? It's a little hard to see here, but it's still pretty round. We feel like there's something under there. As it moves through the 70s, it's slowly going to disappear. We're still getting dragged up, but then we're going to move immediately into that phase 2, which really helps us, as we look at it in the front, feel very columnar. And then almost as quickly as that happens, by about 1855, 56, the bustle comes back, bigger and better and more thought through. And more often than not, I say the first one feels like drapes, phase 1 feels like drapes, phase 2 feels more like upholstery. because it feels much more upholstered around these items. So here we're going to see a variety of different types of corsets. Nothing special. They're just really pretty to look at in a lot of ways, but we can see how the body is moved in to that shaping. And really, when you look at this one, it is pretty rectangular through the torso, right? It doesn't have a ton of like cinching in, but that could be achieved. This one is supposed to mold down here. You can see through all this cording. And then it has eyelet holes down the sides, partially for ventilation. Or you could pull the strings through that to keep the strings from adding bulk around the waist. And we see gores and godets working together to create that bust. This is a sporting corset. So you would wear corsets for, archery, horseback riding, pretty much everything that you would do. And you can see that these sections aren't steel bone. There's a small piece of whalebone there, but it's more cording used, and then through here to control it as well, but it would give you a little bit more flexibility. And then we see that spoon-shaped bust that would help sort of round out or flatten depending on what you want to do. Here we see that spoon bust, and this one is done in leather. Ooh. Here we see sort of the style of the time, very similar to the one that we're seeing here. And you can see that it is very clearly molded over the bosom. You can see even, this is what I love about this one. Can you see the rib bump? Just if you look ever so lightly, you can see how it would have molded around that rib just a little bit. And then shapes all the way down. Here, you can see these little dashes. That's embroidery floss that's put through, called flossing, to hold those bones in place so they don't shift, they don't flip, they don't pop. And then here you can see how it's kind of rounded underneath here, sort of bouncing out a little bit. And then you can see that kind of tatai edging on it. But what's kind of important is see this band that's happening right here. A lot of times if you were wearing evening dresses, which is no longer here, but I'm still motioning as though it is, excuse me, sometimes you would put a band of the textile that it was to be worn with at the top. So if you moved, it would still look like your evening gown, right? So you wouldn't get bra strappiness in a sense, or, seeing the undergarment in there. So this band was probably added to match an outfit from the time. And notice how high in the back this is too, not super plungy. Here we can see how the body would modify. Here we see a 24-inch waist, say, with a well-contoured waist, bringing it down, in this case, about 4 inches. And then you can see how the body would, in a sense, change. When you're getting into the 12, when you're getting into the 10, that's where it's getting dangerous. That's where you're putting pressure, especially on your kidneys and your liver, and that can cause problems. But when you're in a well-fitted corset, you still eat, you can still drink, you can still do all the things that one would do. In fact, if you went to an event, you might have a 20-course dinner in which you would need to eat. Well, no, your body would, again, you're imagining that you're just doing this today for the very first time and it's cutting it up. No, you would just eat slowly. It would move through the body. Eat slowly, move through the body. You don't have to eat everything, but you should eat a bite at least or two of everything. Did you have a question, or were you just stretching?
Good.
Okay, but you can see how the ribs do flex in. And sometimes if you go too far, you can be careful, you might puncture vital organs, so you want to be careful. So here we can see in that first phase, the sort of padding that would be used to shape. And notice there's the pillow in the front, there's the pillow in the back, there's even sort of under structures underneath the hair to give it volume and such. And you can see to round out the bosom, you could even put enhancers through the bosom. We can see a variety, as I said, of different types of bustles, whether it's cloth, like I showed you before, that sort of strap more on the back. This one is more like a crinoline or a cage crinoline that has much more volume on the back. And then the lower ones you can see are very similar to mine, you know, the BVD spiral bustle. How magic is that? And we can see the other ones that are very similar to the one that's right here. Here we can see some other forms. These, again, more focused on the back. And then we can see those wire mesh bustle. We can see bustles like this that sort of move all the way down the body. And you can see that it, you know, is controlled at the hips, but gives volume to the entirety of the back. And certainly much more decorative, much more beautiful than anything we looked at today. This one is a collapsible, you know, so this idea that it would, when you'd sit down or you'd move, it would sort of up. They even have bustle that have stools built into them. I mean, they're novelties. They're not every day, but that you could just sort of release it and then sit down. But you could see how that volume, that structure underneath would help support. So looking at this, can you see kind of the inherent crinoline in it? The crinoline period in it? But really, we're in that first phase where it feels like everything's drawn to the back. Notice the collars are still pretty low, so that tells us it's early. And we have still that 1860s sort of bodice, but moving everything towards the back, still giving us a little bit of roundness. And here we can see, you know, the bodice in its shaping. We can see the volume is through the movement of textile all the way towards the back. Into this sort of lump, and then this sort of apron front or this swag front going on there. Here we see a wedding dress, and see how it feels like curtains. It feels like it's being drawn towards the back, that is doing most of the work. And we're starting to see, you know, again, we could tell this is a formal bodice of some sort because it doesn't have sleeves, but you're seeing like this little bit of a round here where some padding could happen, as well as the padding here on the back. Goodness, I gotta move through this quick. I love this period so much. There's so much to talk about. Or here we see this reception dress, incredibly large in the back, but still feels like the textile's doing that work. Or here, where it feels almost mantua-like with its jupe, and then the skirt being pulled back. And notice these rectangular bodice necklines. Those are very popular as you get towards the 70s. In fact, here we see in the Manet, this one's 1882. She's lower class, but you can see those square necklines that are very popular in this midsection. Here we see just a day dress even with that square neckline with the lace tracing it. So this artist is named Tissot. You can see it a little bit up there, Tissot, and he is the king of phase 2 paintings because everything we see tends to be in his work this phase 2. Do you notice how this fits all the way down past the bum, past the hip, and then the story starts, right? And we can see how much shaping would go into this. Now this here, it's like, what is this? Well, this is actually a dinner dress. So it has the sleeves of a day dress, but the fit and the sort of decoration of an evening gown. Here we can see another Tissot painting, and notice the undulation and the modulation of the human body here. And there's obviously some padding happening through here, but do you notice how that makes the waist feel much smaller? And what's also great is you can see sort of some of the seaming that's happening in there to create the shapes. And that's what's great about his work too, is we can look at it, we can say, this is how this thing would be made. And notice that it's all happening after the fact, comes down the body, and then the story starts. Here we can see some ways that we could add some fullness or add some shaping. Again, still bustles. It's just it moves all the way down to the hip, and then the story starts. Here we see a walking dress, we see a day dress as well, and we can see how we really would need all those seams to really create the shape throughout the body. And you can see that we're sort of taking like, oh, how do we deal with this swag? And how do we deal with this? And you have to imagine all this pleating, all this trim, all this detail was probably done by machine. So definitely phase two. Look at this one. This one's great because, first of all, doesn't it look like a Rococo man's justacord waistcoat in a way? You know, we're talking the 1870s, so you can see how they're going to reference the Rococo. You know, it's just 100 years later. But we see those princess seams working its way down, and with just a few seams, how you can create this beautiful shaping all the way down on this natural form. We see the buttons down here, and then we see even that extra textile sort of brought to the front to give us even more of a column shape. Here we see a wedding dress, and we see this from the back. And again, phase two, it's sort of starting, the story is starting right there. But there is still a little bit of hot glue goo ga going on here. And here are a couple illustrations. This one's from 77. You can see how it would probably look a little bit more on a human body. Here we see the jacket even though this is kind of a two-piece, the jacket itself feels much longer going over the hips. The next one, this one I love because they're using the stripe to accentuate that, right? They're using that visually to sort of round out the fullness of the bust so the waist looks even smaller to then move into the hip. And because we're trying for a very column silhouette, you know, those stripes really help define that as well. What I really love here too is this individual sort of swag that's right here on the side, which was very Charles Worth. He liked asymmetricality. So, and here we can see it again with this sort of sheared section in the front. Here we see again how it's starting to move, but we have this waisting that does continue over the waist, and most of the story is, can you see it sort of popping out right back here? But now, as we start to see the collars move up, we're starting to see the sleeves get full. We know we're getting into the 80s. Look at this. There's a lot going on down here. And so here's what we think of when we think of those 80s, this very strong tabletop silhouette. This is Georges Seurat on the island of Grand Jacques. And you could see how that really cantilevers over. And notice that she's wearing a jacket with then a skirt. You have to imagine that those jackets would have to have a lot of technical tailoring going along with it to make it fit. And then also you'll notice these hats that were so popular that I call flower pot hats, because they look like that, right? Like a flower pot upside down. But here we're seeing that much more refined lyrical silhouette. Notice that the bodice still goes down towards the hip, past the waist, but then it's moving into the bustle. And we're going to start to see those sleeves pop up just the tiniest bit. Here we can see again how cantilevered that feels off the body. And even though it does feel like some of the fabric's doing the work, we have to recognize that it's really the understructure that's telling us, yes, we're jetting off. And can you, it's, oh, you know, they always show these kind of like 3/4, but can you see how probably coming straight on it would feel rather narrow? Drawing a Bustle era renderings is always hard. So here, what I would first of all love about this is a stout costume, perhaps, somebody who isn't, you know, a size 0.5. I love that. But notice how they're using the trim and the details to really emphasize the shaping that is of the fashion of the time. And we can see here in the back, you know, she's not going for a huge bustle, but we do have some cantilever going on. Yeah.
So I'm curious, especially in the phase two, when everything was like really like column shaped.
Yeah.
What would like maternity clothes be like when you're having a child? Like how would that affect?
So the truth is maternity and childbearing is still considered illness in a lot of ways, meaning you wouldn't be seen in public once you started to show. When we get into the 1890s, we're going to see some things of how you could manipulate it, but often you would be shipped away. Like, oh, you're going to visit your Aunt Tessie. And then they block you up in the house, and then magically you would come back with a baby because when we talk about the Victorian era too, sex is not to be talked about in a lot of ways, but certainly in some ways, even here, you could probably hide for a little while under there. Here we see a beautiful reception gown. You can see the volume coming off the back. I love this dress, all in brown silk. And if you can look really carefully, it almost has these very modern, almost like 1950s stars on it. But notice how it's all much more upholstered around the figure than it is dragging and draping and moving. Here we can see some, but really overall, it's the skirt and the bodice are very straight. And then there's jetting out the back. Here we see some sporting outfits. Notice again, this jacket sort of idea, this upper is very clearly moved over. Plaid, who doesn't love a plaid? Nothing interesting really to see there. It's brown, I love brown. But here we see the plaid being used as well with that jetting off the back. We're seeing a much sort of more fitted bodice through there and just these little details. And then notice that collar is higher. Notice how it's starting to come up into that Victorian world that we know and love so much. Here we can see as well, with almost a suit style to it. There's just too many things to see, I know. When Japan opened its doors, it went crazy for the Bustle era. And so we see illustrations like this. There are hundreds of these. And what I love the most is they're using traditional textiles, Japanese textiles, but with this sort of tailoring in there. And you can see this one especially. This has a very specific name, this ombre, but it is a traditional Japanese textile. And we can see it here as well. Look how cute that is. I love it. So fun. And then we can see formal. Can you see how, like before, you could tell this is a very formal situation, a court situation because of its size. A great evening gown. Again, notice its modulation through the body. Just a little bit of a kick off the back, but certainly setting us up for modern evening gowns. And then two other sort of evening gowns. Notice again, very little sleeve on those. When we talk about shoes, most people are tending to wear shoes as we see up here, again, the return of the heel. We tend to think of boots, but those are primarily for activities, for outside events. But here we can see some beautiful boots in their embroidery and their details. And notice, the lacing. This one especially looks like a corset in a sense on the leg. You can imagine how sexy that would be. Here we see, the use of buttons all the way up, in which we'd use a button hook. And because of its complication, that's eventually why we created the zipper in 1891. And we're going to see some sporting outfits, like this is a riding habit because you would sit side saddle, and it even has a bustle in the back. So when you sit, it sort of splays out over your body. Wraps become very popular, but notice it's incredibly tailored still. It's to look like you've just thrown this wrap over, but it's not. There are hundreds of seams in there to mold it around, to emphasize the back, and to create this sort of roundness. In the next one, you'll see this, not this one, evening, whatever. In this one, notice how the sleeve is actually shaped, right? Because your arms can't really be down at your sides, like hanging out. You sort of keep them in this sort of half movement, but it's cleared up in the back so the bustle can come out, so it lays right down the front. I love this one. And by the 1890s, this is where we are. We see the puff in the sleeve, we see the high collars, and that column style that will sort of tell us about the fin de siècle, or the 1890s. Some children's clothes, just to see how they would work with those. 5 minutes left. So we'll skip through men's clothes because it's boring. But the thing that we really focus on in this period is sporting wear, modeled after the suit. So this is a golfing suit or a walking suit. Notice the four-in hand tie, just like I'm wearing today. Notice the wing collar that we often see with tuxedos even today. This jacket becomes very popular. This jacket is called the Norfolk. It has this belt that goes around. It's a very casual sporting outfit. This is what you would play golf in. You would play tennis in this. See, carrying tennis rackets. You would go hunting in this. And if you ever watch Downton Abbey, every time they go hunting, this is what they wear, these tweeds. We can see the Norfolk jacket. It has the pleats down the side, these big patch pockets, and then that belt. It's one of my favorites. And we see sort of the three phases of men. You know, they're kind of relegated to these three things. Well, they'd have a fourth, which would be evening, but they have day, business, and then casual, a suit. That's it. If you're a businessman, this is what everybody looks like. And we can see, you know, the frock coat's still the same as we saw before, a waistcoat, in this case, double-breasted in gray, and these gray chalk striped trousers are like, you walk around New York in this time and this, everybody looks the same, basically. So back here, we're seeing something special, which is called a tuxedo. The idea of a tuxedo was it was a gentleman's suit in black, cut like a tailcoat, meaning silk lapels and such, but it has a short sack jacket. And it was just intended to be worn at men's clubs. It was casual dress. We think of tuxedo today as like the most dress, but it was considered to be casual dinner dress. And then here we can just see some no good nicks from the period and all sorts of variations of things. Four-in-hand tie, right? No collar, very weird, strange mustache. Look at this. So we see that collar, that disposable or that starch collar, and then we see the four-in-hand. I love that it's sort of drawn over to the side, looking all crazy. But then I'd buy this tie today. If this tie was up, I would be into it. Boring. Okay. So there we are. We got through it. But I have 3 minutes. Do you mind turning on the light? There's been a surprise that has been happening right in front of you that you didn't even notice. What do you think that surprise was? The what?
You lie about everything.
I do lie about everything. But today, for this whole time that you've been here with me, I have been wearing a corset.
Really?
So just to show you that I can still use my breath, I can still talk. I couldn't bend down all that great, but there it is, folks. Now it's modern. It has a whisper more give. But it is with plastic bones that sort of simulate whalebone and such. And to prove to you that I am not in discomfort, it's not pushing all the gas out. I wasn't like farting, dropping stink bombs everywhere. The only thing is you have to reevaluate a little bit about how you move. And ultimately, the only challenge that gentlemen often have with these lower front bodices is sort of bending over and moving and sitting, but we make it through. But ultimately, it can happen. And I can still sing, I can still talk. I probably was just as loud as I always am loud. I wasn't, and so that's why I always like to wear it during this time, to show you that they are, if you're wearing the right size, you've tightened correctly, it should cause no problems at all. So there's the secret. It's been here in front of you the whole time. What did you say? It is happy. But it's not April Fool's because it's real. Questions? Concerns? Okay. Now I have to take off my corset.